slides on eFundi now, so they are available there if you want to see them. So you can go there and you can see them. So let me just share my screen with you guys. Okay, so right. Good morning, everybody. First of all, before we continue, I'd just like to first of all talk about Project One and the submission of Project One. So I've been getting a lot of queries that people are emailing me that are unsure about many different things. And I would just want to ask you to please, there are so many of you. We have, quite a large group of students. And if every single person emails me something like, must the project be private or public, and those types of questions, we have addressed them in class. But yeah, your projects that you submit must be a project that we see all your tasks and your boards, and then your actual repo, and these things must be private. And then you must share it with us. So I've got people that are actually sharing to my Northwest University email address. That is completely wrong. You must use the actual requirements as we've asked you to, to share them in our this thing, right? Let's see what's happened to it now. Yeah, you must just make sure that you're sharing properly to our not to our Northwest University addresses. Yeah, and so we've been getting lots of queries about submission. So please just read the requirements again and make sure that you actually do just submit them properly and you follow the requirements. The requirements are very clear. If you're unsure about something, just go back, read the requirements again and see that you can comply to it. And then we've put on videos on the YouTube channel. Go and look at the videos first before you ask questions. And what we mainly want to see is that you've actually now shown that you've read through the projects, you've actually given a detailed analysis of your time, that you've included many different aspects of what we are doing, the training, your certifications, you will upload to the link we provide. And the other question was, how do we know that it is there? Now, if you've submitted it, it should be there. If there's any, we can't go now and just verify, oh, you did submit and you didn't. We will pick that up later when we start marking. So yeah, I can't go now and look for each person, did you upload or not? So just be aware of those types of things. Hopefully everything will go well, and please submit by 5 o'clock today. Right, so for today, what we are going to be doing is we are going to start now on how to implement our API. So what I'm going to cover with you today is I'm going to be looking at aspects such as, the controllers that are routing information to the right place, to the right actions that sit in our code, how we are going to be accessing our data with the Entity Framework Core, and then I'm going to do a demo. Okay, and then for our, just to make it a bit more interesting, here is a link that I've given you here that you can go and have a look at. It's last year, it's actually the latest Stack Overflow review that one can look at to see, what are developers across the world? What are they saying about what technologies and tools one should use? And so what I would like you to go and have a look there is to see, that what we are busy with is actually very relevant. In terms of web frameworks, ASP.NET Core is quite high up in the ladder. And have a look there and to see, if you had to now today decide for yourself, in what field do I want to go into? Where is the most popular skills and tools that I have to know? Have a look at that, and then you'll see that what we are doing here is highly relevant. And what you must also remember is that what we are doing here is transferable knowledge. So what I'm teaching you here today about APIs, you will, have in the other frameworks very similar concepts. They all basically do very similar things. So, if you now have implemented an API here in the .NET framework, then you can easily transfer your knowledge to the others, and you know what to do. you know and you understand it. So that's why we've decided to use this specific platform to develop our code in, because it is actually something that is very relevant and that industry wants. Right, so the first thing we are going to start off with is basically what are our controllers. Okay, so where, in the terms of how we design APIs, where does this whole thing about controllers sit? So it's basically part of something called the Model View Controller, MVC pattern, which is a software pattern that has been created to implement web applications with user interfaces. And there are three main components that we need, and those are the models, the views, and the controllers. And so this is an architectural pattern that we've used for many years. And that's essentially, if I talk about an API controller, it is part of this whole pattern. And it's all about code reuse and implementing and developing code using best practice. Right, so for our purposes, when we are looking at our whole environment, how does it work? Okay, so what we see is this little diagram shows us exactly what we are going to be doing. So, we are sitting here, have some client, and the client is going to make a HTTP request, and everything mainly sits on a web server. So there is your HTTP request coming through, and your code will be sitting on a web server. While we are implementing on our local machines, we have something called localhost, which is hosting our local, code. And the first thing that happens is your code, let's say you're saying get student. So you want to do a get. That is essentially your HTTP request. What has to happen now is that somewhere there is a code sitting somewhere, and it has to be sent to that place. So how does it actually know? So get student, where is student sitting, and what is get? So what we have is we have an ASP.NET routing engine. And this engine now I'm going to show you just now in more detail how this works. This engine is actually going to now route through to your actual code, and what is doing the controlling? So that's why we call it a controlling. We call them controllers, okay? So we are going to be creating something called a controller. It's a C# class. And what does this do? It's an entry point. It's a main entry point where requests are handled that come in from the user, and these requests are sent to the right place, okay? And so basically, what do we now also have? We have a controller, and the controller interacts with something called a model. And the model is essentially the state of the application. In other words, this is where the actual student sits, the state of a student. So if I say get my student, I have to route through the routing engine to the controller to get to the actual, we're going to call it the data that's sitting there. And we today are only going to be focusing on this. Then we have the view. Now the view is something, a representation of my student. Now I'm going to show my student to my actual user. But for our purposes, for project 2, we are not interested in this. So essentially, project 2 is like that. We are doing that part of the MVC pattern. And we are today going to focus mainly on our controller and our model and how we do this routing. And so that is what we are going to be implementing in code, is a controller and a model, and how the interaction works using, you can see we are using our CRUD model. Right. So basically, what are these endpoints or controllers? Yeah, so it's not an action endpoint, it's a controller. It's a logical grouping of things that we call actions or endpoints. Okay, so the word action is also a word that comes up. Okay. So we are executing action methods. So that's what we call the interaction of these things. Like these are your public methods. Your public methods are called action methods. So we are going to create these action methods inside a controllers folder. So in your project, you are going to create a folder called controllers. It's actually done for you. And we are going to put our controllers that are going to be invoking. Let's say you're calling a student. It will be get student, post student. So a controller groups all those HTTP verbs that we have, or we call them actions. And these are then all inheriting from the system web HTTP API controller class that will ensure, that's the base class that gives you all the options that you need. And that is then for all the HTTP verbs. So the web API decides, so first of all, the web API decides which controller and which action method inside the controller will actually have to be invoked. So in other words, your API has a controller. Your call is rooted there, and inside it there are many actions that belong to this one controller. Essentially, the controller is all about a certain resource. Last week we spoke about resources. Okay, so basically how would the code work? So let's say I've written this code. So here we see, it's basically a bit of an implementation here, but here we see API controller and here we see student controller. So here I have a student controller inheriting from this base class API controller. And what do I see? I see all the things I can do on my student. I can get, you can say get student. So that will be getting all the students. Getting a specific student, number 5, so get student 5, or I'm going to say be opposed to a student, or I can say do something to a specific student or delete a specific student. So these are all my action methods. So I have a controller called students controller with many action methods or actions that I can invoke. Right. So how does this work when we are doing the call? So the client is going to send, you can see here is my request that is being sent in. The client is sending HTTP GET. So when it arrives at the web routing environment, you can see my web API will look at two things. First of all, it will say, okay, you want to get and you want to get the student. So those two things are important for it to see. So first of all, when I see student, then I see, okay, you want to get the student, so you want to go and you want to route into the student controller. You could have many controllers sitting on your web API, but this is how it will know. Okay, here comes a request. Where does it go? It goes to student. And what is the action method that you want to do? Well, the action method is you want to get. And that is how, when a request comes in from the outside, how the right code will be invoked. And you can see it on the other side, here is a post coming in for a student. So we are going to invoke inside the student controller, we are going to be invoking a post. And this is essentially what we are going to be implementing today. And you'll see how basically very straightforward it is. Right, so that is the first thing we understand is what is a controller, what is an action method, how do we do the routing? The routing is basically done in the framework automatically for us. We do not have to worry about it. The second thing we now have to look at is, okay, now this is the straightforward part that we have. The second point that we have to consider today is our data. How do I actually now do my database? Okay. How do I call my database? And in the .NET environment, there is something called Entity Framework Core. And it is an object, we call it an object relational mapper that we have for data access. And so this is just a way of really, making things so much easier for us as software developers. So what we basically see that, as a software developer, very often you are working, when you are writing programs, you are writing classes. So there we have many classes. And you are invoking these classes, they have properties, they have methods, and you understand how it works. And you write your code, you understand your programming language, and you do this. But in a database, there are tables, and the tables basically have rows. And these are then rows and columns. You have to know about primary keys and all these things. And then between these two different types of ways of storing, you could, your classes also have data in them and so on. But there's what we call a mismatch. There's somehow a bit of a mismatch, so, you have to go from one way of thinking to another way of thinking when you are working with your data. So you have to now, when you as a software developer have to now call the database, okay, so there is like a database that I now have to call, and inside the database is a table, and I have to now set up my connection string, which is very often a big story. And I have to make a call in SQL, and I have to run through it in writing all my SQL and then get it back. And there's a lot of issues here. So what they say is, why don't we go for software developers, and why don't we try to make this just a little bit easier? Let's just, improve this whole process here so that it's more natural for a software developer to write code. And so this is what an object relational mapper will do. So in our framework, it will automatically say, you have some database tables, and what I'm going to do for you is I'm going to create some classes, and your classes are now going to be available in code, and you will be able to write your code on the classes, and automatically your database will be updated as these classes are called and so on. So basically what it does, it maps between two worlds, okay? The relational database and the object-oriented software code. There's a mapping that happens. And so basically this brings a lot of, saves a lot of time and effort and pain, if you want to call it that, in this framework. Now it comes, now you must always remember, now we are taking you away, we are extracting you away from the actual database. That means it becomes more complex, it becomes more difficult to change things. So when you do this, like I'll show you our example, you have to be sure that your database is now being done properly, because you can't really just quickly tweak your database after that without going and changing this whole mapping thing. And there's so it's also that there's thinking about performance and all these things. You have to think about this very carefully, but it brings with it a lot of productivity. It's much easier to do things. So we are going to be following this approach to create our controllers. It's going to help us a lot to create our controllers. Okay, and essentially this is what's happening. So you have a database. On the one hand, you have classes, and on the other hand, you have tables. And in the middle sits Entity Framework Core, and I can go both ways. So what I can do is I can create first of all, my class, and I can then make it go and create a database table from that for me. And secondly, I can have a database and I can make it create classes for me. So you can go up and down depending on how you wish. You can do that whatever you like. Okay, and basically then what happens is the following. So basically, if I have a database table, in my code, I won't work with a table any longer, but I'm going to work with a class. And basically my columns, my table columns will become properties or fields. My rows are going to become elements in a collection. My primary keys will become a unique class instance. Foreign keys will be references and so on. So essentially, you are now going to not work with database tables, but you are going to be working with your classes and everything associated to your class. And there are two approaches here, two approaches that we can see that we follow. Okay, and the one is called the code first, and the second one is called the database first. And it's essentially what I've just shown you here. So code first is starting with the code and going to the database. Database first is starting with the database and going to the code. You can choose whichever you want depending on your situation. So somebody would say, now, why would I use code first? So sometimes a program would run, and then in between somewhere you want to create a temporary database table that you will get rid of later on. And this is code first. Quickly create the database table in code, save some data, do some stuff, and you can perhaps delete it afterwards. So that's code first. Database first means the database is there, it's being created, it's set, and I just want to use those tables in code as classes. So basically you can see, here we see code first. Code first is having classes and creating, tables. But what we are going to be doing, in our example, in our API is we are going to say, here is your database, okay? We have a database, we're going to give you a database, we always will have a database. And so what we are going to say is, I want you to create your context and entity classes from which you are going to be working. So we are going to follow for our purposes for this, project, we are going to be following the database first approach. Okay, so basically what will happen? We are going to, when we are doing this, we are going to create a model for an existing database inside the actual, we're going to create this model. And we are going to do some process called reverse engineering. We call it scaffolding. So we're going to scaffold something, and we are going to be creating something called a database context, the DB context, which will be basically consist of entities. You can see entities and their context classes. And so essentially, what is this thing? This thing is a session. Okay, it's a session that you can use to query and to save. So you're creating something in between. So you see there is your database table, and there is like the model that you've created. And in between, there is the session. And this session is then going up and down between the two, which you are working with to do all your interactions that are going to be saved inside the database and that you are going to be working with. Okay, so for example, if you look at what is a model is essentially something like this, just a basic class that we have where we store information. Then we have something called the DB set class, and you can see here I have the DB context, and it consists out of different, you can see in that case, different database sets that are created for reading and updating and deleting and so on. So that is a DB set class. And there's your DB context. And you can see your DB context is used now for many things. So here we see our entities, which are our, basically you could say our database tables. And here we have our database. And so we can query, we can change tracking, we can do persistence, we can manage relationships, caching, transaction, and many other things. So you can see your database context is something that really helps you a lot to interact with your database. Okay, and so for today, I'm just going to put this here, for our module training. So what are we going to do? And I think I actually just, let me just get back here. I forgot to put on my camera. Okay, so let me just quickly go back here. So what do we want to do for you this week? So, we are giving you these homework exercises. I'm just going to talk about it here because the slide is here. But what we want you guys to do, if you are going to leave this, I'm saying this again, for the end, you're going to struggle because very often, you have problems just installing the tool. It takes you a few days sometimes. Some people just really struggle with that. You struggle with data or whatever it is. So today I'm going to do this demonstration for you. And when I do it, I suppose it may look quite straightforward, and it is actually quite straightforward. But what I want you to do is redo this before we get to the next classes, because next week we are going to be looking at how to go on the cloud, and then we are going to be looking at how to add security. So try to do this week. So I'm going to show you now how to do this whole thing. But I expect of you to actually go and do it yourself, to go and create some controllers and just to sort out your small issues. Last year we had so many people who could not complete project 2 because they do not listen to what we tell them. We understand what the issues are going to be. And the whole idea is for you is to sort out your issues before the time. Don't leave it for one day. So please go and do, the work that we are now going to be telling you to do. Right, so basically, we are now going to be doing a demo. So what is this demo about? I just want to, first of all, before we do the demo, let's just talk about what is it that I'm doing. And then when I do it, it just perhaps will make so much more sense. The first thing is we are going to create a database. You need a database. You cannot do some, you just have to. And we you've done some courses on databases. We assume that this is not something we teach you here. It's not important. You should just know how to do it. But basically, your database is a local database that is going to be sitting on your computer. It's a local one, but when we do project 2, so this is now a local database for now. But next time when you do it, actually, when we mark your project 2, your database will be hosted on Azure. It will be an Azure hosted cloud database. It'll be the same one. You'll just put it up there. And it's also, again, not too complicated to do that. But we are basically working with SQL Server Management Studio. So SQL Server Management Studio must be installed on your local machine with the right drivers. We'll give you everything how to do that. And inside this database, we will give you 3 tables that, you're going to create a database with 3 tables or whatever. And then these are the tables that we will be updating from our API. So that's the first thing that we want you to do. Right, then the second thing, you have to install Visual Studio 2022 with the right versions. So yeah, you need to then, for the API that we are going to be creating, we are going to be doing controllers. And then we are going to be interacting, so calls are going to be made to your controllers, and your controllers are going to be interacting with your database. And your controllers essentially are going to be, for every table, you're going to have a separate controller. So there will be a controller, there will be one, and there will be one. And each of these controllers are going to be talking to a certain database table that you, let's say, products. You're going to have a products controller talking to the products table. But like I said, in the middle, we are going to create the EF, the entity framework, the DB context. And this is going to now be interacting on behalf of, so in other words, you are not going to be directly talking to the database. You are going to be calling these classes, and they will be doing the updates and the actual, and you'll see it's really, if you've done it once, it's not really that bad. And so, but what we need to get to the database is the connection string. You need a connection string to know how to connect to your actual database. But when we now go to Azure, you're going to need a database connection string to cloud. Okay, this is just a local one, and then we are going to need one for the cloud. So this is essentially what I'm going to show you now. So let me just quickly get to the right, going to close this. Okay, are there any questions? Let's say, yeah, so somebody says, can I use SQL Server or SQL Server Lite? That wouldn't really, we are going to use SQL Server. Yeah, so I think, so yeah, I'm not going to go through all of these questions now, because I'm going to let me first do the demo, and then we can see, what it is that we'll do. Okay, so I'm going to I have installed SQL Server. So, this is now the SQL Server that you should be using. If we should just quickly go and look at how it's done, we've given you 2 documents. So here is the first document that what I've done is on Ifundi, under the Resources tab, I've given you a guidance document. Now, this guidance document now gives everything that I'm doing here. It's there. So, you cannot say that you didn't know. Everything is in that guidance document, and all the instructions are there really step for step. So here is the guidance document, and then on the first link is how to install, SQL Server. So here it gives you the whole thing. And then you also need to install the latest drivers, the OLDB drivers for SQL Server. And so you can just go and install these tools. Then I would also recommend that you download .NET 6.0. You can see this is the latest one. And then here's another document to look at how to actually use the Entity Core tools. And here they tell you, how to install the latest version, and then these are some of the commands that we are going to be using. So all this information is in the document, and you can just go and see it there. Okay, but let's have a look at our database. So, my server name, this is now the local host. This is my local machine name. It's called NW user. I connect to my database, and you can see here is my database. So here sits the database engine with the databases. And I today want to actually just use a database called ProductsDB. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the actual script to actually run this. So let me, so I'm not going to ask you to go and create this database. This database has got 3 tables. it's got the category. Let's have a look at the category table. So if I look at the category table, you can see that I've created the category table with two, and later on we'll look at these rows, So what you can see is here is my category table, and it's got two categories, books and solid state drives. So that's inside my categories table. The products and the store table actually don't have much in, but these are so you see you've got a products table and a store table, okay? So what we are going to give you is a script. So let me just show you what the script looks like. So here we see a script, and this script is then a script that you can run. So you can see this is called products DB. So if you run the script, you will be able to create exactly the same data that I'm doing. The database, you just have to populate the table with data. So here is the whole script. And so all that you really do is you go and you say new query, and here's a new query. You copy and paste that script in. Now that script is in the document I gave you. It's right at the end. The script is in the document. You go and paste this in here and you run it, you execute it, and you will see that you will now create a new database with that name, products DB, and you'll have the database available on your computer. And so if you rerun this, obviously you can't rerun this directly over it because you've already now created a database. It says here, create database products DB. You cannot do this over and over. It's going to give you an error. So you have to delete. If you have a problem, you delete the database you created and rerun the script, and you can recreate the database. So that's the first thing that we have to do. Okay. Right. So now we have our database set up. You run the script, you've got your database set up. And so the next thing we have to do is we actually have to go and we have to now go and create a file that is going to help us to get to the connection string. So what I would like you to do is do a new text document. So I'm just going to start a new text document. I'm just going to call it connect.db. So I want to create a connection string to the database, and this is just a little trick that one can use to actually create it. So what you now do is make sure that you are seeing your file extension names. You just have to go and change your file settings for that. So I don't want to open that, sorry. Okay, I just want to, and then what I do is I change this extension to UDL. Okay, so I'm changing it. And so this is now a different file type. So it's a universal data link type of file. And so what you now do is you double click on it. And so now you can put in, okay, what is my server name? As you saw just now, it was called NW server. I'll just put it in W server. That was the name of my server. What we are going to be using is integrated Windows security. So for now, I'm locally on my computer, and I'm going to use my integrated security that I have locally. When we are going to do this for the cloud, you'll have to specify a specific username and password, because you're going to go out of your domain. But now for our purposes, we are using this. So then the next thing that you do is now you select your server, because it now knows where is your actual, and now you're going to create, and I want to go, and the database that I'm now looking at is called products DB. So products DB is my database, and I say, okay. Right, and so now in the background, it makes this connection, and now if I change this back to text, I'm changing it back to text, and if I double click on this thing, now I've got here information that is my connection string that I have. And this is that part that I'm showing you here is the part that I will be using. But the only thing that I found is that when I was using this, there was now it all depends on your problems and things that you come across, but I was having issues with a server certificate. So it doesn't have it in this, but I've added another property, trust server certificate equal true. You know, so you can, if you should have a problem in that it says that it doesn't trust the server certificate, then you need to add that option there as well. So basically now we have our database connection. Okay. Right. So now, so basically, you know, that's the first part that's done. We have a database, we have a connection string, and now we can start creating our API. So I can go here to my Visual Studio. Okay, before I continue, let me just see, is everyone with me? Okay, everything seems to be in order. Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so the next thing we are going to be doing now is we are starting now to create our project. So I'm going to say over here, create a new project. I'm going to say ASP.NET Core Web API. And I'm going to call it, let's call it API class, to something like that, whatever you want to call it. Okay, so then I'm going to say I'm working today on .NET 6 authentication. Here I'm going to say none. When we get to the cloud, we may change that. For now, it's just none. We have HTTPS, we use controllers, we use Open API, which is our Swagger support, and we say create. Okay, so now you've set up some options there that configures your project, and let's just see what we have. So what we see here is that we have here, we actually have controllers. Our weather forecast controller is there. There's our program, and here's our weather. If you look at, we looked at this last time. You know, this is the weather forecast. You could say this is the little model where the data is stored. This is the controller that sits there, you know, where you can see. So in other words, I talked just now about the routing of the controller. It's actually sending the controller through the weather forecast controller. And you can see here is my HTTP GET, which is now my action method that is being invoked. But what we know for our purposes is we do not want to use this. So we are going to delete the weather forecast controller and the model. So we are going to be using our own ones in our code. Okay, so what's in the program? You can see in the program, you can see here, it's just saying here that, you know, when this is run, add controllers, it's going to use Swagger, you know, it's using redirection, authorization, whatever. So yeah, this is just telling you, okay, what are all the things that are going to be used and invoked in your, when you interact. So let's have a look at our properties. We have launch settings. These launch settings, you know, if I should run this, for example, what I see here is that what are my IIS is our local server. There's no authentication, but here's my profile for my application. It's a project. And if I should run this thing, let me just quickly show you what happens. Yeah, it doesn't have any operations. We deleted that thing, but look at that. I just wanted to show you the address. It says localhost 7024. And so basically you can see that is that URL that is sitting over there. That's why it says 7024, because it has been specified here in your launch settings. Okay, so that's what that does. And then if I look at my dependencies and my frameworks, what have I got here? I've got ASP.NET Core. If I look at what is the properties of this, you'll see it's over there, 6.6. Okay, there's my packages and so forth. Right, so you now have looked at what is available in your API class. And so the first thing we now need to do is we want to use EF Core. Okay, so what we have to go to do to access EF Core is we have to now go into the package manager, and we have to install our packages that we are going to be using. So you basically go here to browse, and we are going to be installing 4 different ones. They are the entity framework core packages that I'm going to be using here. I'm going to be installing 4 of them. So you have to do this, each of them one by one. I'm going to say I want to install it into my project. And we are going to be using the latest one here, 606021, that just to make sure it's more compatible with what we are doing. And I'm going to be installing this one here. And you accept that. And then I'm going to be doing the design one, the same thing. There's one called design. And we're going to be using the same one here. Tools. And then SQL Server. Right, so now we've installed these 4 different packages. You can see over here, there they are all sitting. So you have them available now. And so then we go down here to the left bottom side, the package manager console. Okay, and the first thing that we need to do is just verify that EF Core is available and in good order. So we say .NET EF, which is EF Core, and we enter. And so basically, if you then see this message here, then you know everything is fine and you can continue. So it's been installed properly. Right, so now you've got all the packages in, the classes are there, and you can now continue to, and the next step that we want to do now is we now want to go and we want to create that link, that DB context that I've explained to you. So what we have is we have our database called products DB, and it's got 3 tables. It's got the products, the categories, and the store type. It's a store table. And so what we want to do is we want to now, create the model. So essentially, you want to take the tables in the database and you want to create in code here. So in other words, here where we look at our solution, what you want to in the end see in your solution is you want to see a model there that has been created that you can now interact. Instead of interacting with the category ID, there is in your class there, a property that you can interact with. Right, so for that purpose, what we are going to be doing is we are going to do something called scaffolding, okay? So I'm going to now, first of all, let me just copy this command. So you can see here is the command. If you look down here at the bottom, this is now the command that we are going to be using to take the EF Core classes and to create a session in. And so you can see it says .NET EF DB context. So that's what you're going to be creating, scaffold. And then here is a parameter there for my connection string, Microsoft Entity Framework Core .SQL Server. And I want to create my model. So that's basically, I'm going to be doing that. And let me just get here. This is now my DB context. So I'm going to be taking this part here. So in other words, I have to tell it, you want to do scaffolding, but where is the database? And I need to now add the database in there. So I'm going to do that. And I'll just put that in there and I'm going to enter. So now in the background, it should take these classes I've now installed and create a link to my database creating my models. Okay, so it's done this. We should have done it. Did it do it? No. Doesn't reference Microsoft Entity Framework Core Design. Okay, so it's giving me a problem, and I've had this before, and I think this is also something that you will probably also run into.
Prof, if you right click on API class and you go to
I've seen before that when you're looking at your dependencies, so they all now disappeared. So that is very strange. Did I forget? Sorry, Miss Miller, did you see me doing something wrong with the packages?
Not with the packages, but I think if you try save your API class CS proj, it should work.
See there. Daddy? No. Okay, so something went wrong. Okay, guys, and this is what will happen to all of you also. I don't know why they're not there.
Can you hear me, Prof?
Okay, so I think I'll have to redo those classes, those packages. Let me just do that. Tools. Just make sure why that wasn't there. Take that one. It is here.
Prof, can you hear me?
Okay, so I now have to just find out how do we get .NET packages. What is the command here? It's .NET packages. I think it's .NET. No. Sorry, guys, I'm just going to quickly now. This is what typically would happen to all of you. What is the command there? Oh, it's got list. .NET list packages, sorry. I want to see what's going on my packages. .NET list packages. Okay, does anybody have a, what am I doing wrong there? Package, oh, sorry, package. Okay, so the only package that I have in here, even though I did do that whole process, is just that one, which is quite interesting. So even that shows me here, I'm gonna, okay, let me just uninstall this. And now that appears. So let me try this again. Package reference. Okay, I'm just going to build this thing. Perhaps the build sometimes helps. Okay, so there we are. So yeah, I just want to also, this is what typically happens to all of us. And, I also had some issues yesterday. I got it right. And again, it's like, Murphy's Law. But in any case, so here we see I've got the core framework is in the design, the tools. The one that is not here now is the SQL Server. And let me just see, there is SQL Server. And let me install it. And let's hope that this one will work. And yeah, and that's something, you must be prepared to struggle like this. I mean, it just happens like it happens. This is the problem, if you look at all these packages, they have so many versions going on. And, it makes our life more complicated. It does make, if it works, it works. But on the other hand, it can also give us a lot of issues. So let me just build this thing again. I'm going to build it. And then I'm going to run this thing again. Okay, now I've got all of, now this compares. So you want to see this compares to what I have there. Now I've got SQL Server there, and hopefully, let's try again. So we are now going to do the scaffolding again. So hopefully everything is in place, and I'm going to be able to, there's my command. So I'm going to say scaffold, using this connection string, scaffold it to the model. So let's see what happens this time. Okay, and there we have it. So there we have it. So, if you should run across this problem, this is what you must do. At least this happened. Because I think, unfortunately, with all the, versions that we sit with, we sometimes run into these types of issues. And what I can say is just build your application. That helps a lot. So what we now see is, okay, there is the models. And so now what's happened is you can now see here is my models. My models have now been created from my database table. So I have a category table, and our category table is now represented here as a model, a class called category ID, name, description, and date created. Like I showed you in the database table, I have a products one, and all the products, you can call them the columns of the products table, are now properties in this class called products. And I have the store. So I've got these three database tables are now sitting in my code as models. So I don't have to actually now make a call to the database. I'm just going to be using this. And what's linking it all together is something called the products DB context class. So you can see the products DB context class. So that is the name of my database, products DB, and it's called the context. So this is my DB context, which is my session that is linking my code to my database. Okay. And so basically here, this is my model that if you think about the MVC, this is your model that you're using. It does tell me here that it's not the best option to put your connection string here in code, because if anybody should hack into my code, you see there sits my connection string, and it's not really good practice. And we need to actually just get rid of it. And we'll look at that. But basically, this is where you can see we talked about the entity. There's my category entity, my product entity, and my store entity. And these entities are now updated and queried and managed in terms of whatever from here. So this code is now what has been done for me. And I don't have to write the code to interact with the database. The model is here. Okay, so I've got my models going now. Right, so the next step is after you actually now have managed your models, okay, the next is that we should actually now say, but okay, I want to change my, I want to follow best practice, and I'm actually going to put inside my launch settings, no, not there, sorry, the app settings here. I'm actually here going to put in my connection string in here. So I'm going to create something called default connection, and I'm just going to move it. You can move it out of the code here, but basically you're going to be putting your connection string inside this app settings here, and we can then see what we'll do with that. And now we are going to be creating my controllers to update the database. Okay, so when we are creating a controller, what do we do? So we go here to controller. Okay, now there's nothing at this stage. That's just the folder name. And we have to say add controller. I'm going to choose API here. I'm going to create an API. And if you're going to do the whole MVC, you're going to be doing that. And I'm going to say, I want to create an API controller with actions using entity framework. So in other words, all the HTTP method actions, and I'm going to use entity framework to actually be calling my data. I'm going to add that. Okay, so what we have here is now we say, right, my model that I'm using is my category. Let's use the category table. It's going to be called categories controller. You can now call it whatever you like here, but I'm just going to leave it categories controller. And I'm going to be using the session that has been created for me called the products DB context to link everything up. And so you're going to Okay, so now it's gone and it's created for me, and you can see there is my categories controller. Okay, and so what does the categories controller have here? You can now see, it's got the routing. In other words, the routing I explained to you before. It is the in the framework, the routing, classes that are available are going to route you in here. You're routing here to categories. If you should say, I want to get categories, it's going to route you in here, inheriting from controller base, and you can now see that I can now say, here's my get, okay? And the first one is just get. You can see it will get all categories. Then here's one for getting a specific category. So if you're going to say get a specific one with an ID, it is going to be invoking this code. If you're going to put a specific, you can see there is the code for that. If you are going to post to categories, you can see that is the code for that. If you are going to be deleting something specific, that is the code for that. So you can see that it's actually gone and it's created all the different options that one needs to be, so you can now do all the CRUD operations on your database table called categories. You can add, you can change, you can delete and whatever. And so let's run this and see what it looks like. So I'm going to invoke my API class there and see whether it actually has done this properly. Okay, so now you can see it's running now on that URL that we said it would run, and now it's invoking Swagger as the open IP. It's the open API model specification that we are using. That will specify your classes and everything for your API. But what we see here is it actually shows us now you can see that is the categories to get and to post, then to get a specific one, to put a specific one, and to delete one. So let's see if I say get. Okay, so I'm going to say get, try it out, and then execute. Okay, so basically what happens here, you can now see there's an error. It says here, now I can clearly see my error. It says here 500 means internal server error. Essentially whenever, and this is something you must note here now, is, I'm now sitting on the other side of the world. I'm a developer. I've written this code and now I'm getting this error. So I'm looking at this error, and this is just an error that has been thrown directly out of the, framework. It just throws this error. If you were sitting, so just remember now, let's say you are a developer, you are using, someone else's API, and this error happens. So what are you looking at? So sometimes it's very difficult if you're not a part of that framework to know what's going on. So, ideally the errors that we should send to the other side, where the developers are invoking our code, should not look like this. Okay, but we haven't done any error handling, so it won't be anything more than this. But what we see here, for example, is it says that unable to resolve the DBX, the product's DB context. So in other words, there's something in my code that's still wrong. So when the get is being called, it's not getting the right thing. So let's see what we did wrong. Okay, and basically, if I go to my program here, where I'm now, running from, I need to add some stuff in here, okay? So I just have to quickly get that line to copy. The first thing I have to add in here is I have to tell it that when this has been run, we are going to say I'm using Entity Core Framework here so that I can actually, reference the models and things that I'm using. And I'm also going to use my specific, my thing is called API class. I'm going to be using the model here. So I have to add that in here so that it knows that when you are running this, that you are going to be using that. And something else that I also have to add in here to now, and the problem that we have here is something called dependency injection, which we'll talk about later. I actually have to also add in the connection string over here before I do the controller. So I say builder.services.you add controllers. And so then I'm going to add in this connection string to say, right, use the default connection that was set up. And then here is the DB context that we are using to actually get to the information that we are. So you've set up everything that you need, but now you have to reference it and you're going to be referencing it in this way. Right, so let's just build this quickly to make sure it's fine. So yeah, so that was what was missing, is just the references to, your models and your DB context, so that you can actually call this. So let's run it again. Okay, so let's see if we now can call it. So try it out. Okay, so now you can see it actually works. So I'm saying I want to get my categories table, and it's giving me the whole table. So here I can see, so I have my 2 rows. I just had those 2 rows in my table. So this works. Okay, so now I'm going to post. So if I want to post, I'll say try it out. Okay, and it says here, okay, so I want to post to my database. So let me make a new category, and I'm going to make it, let me call it media. I'm just going to call it media, and then I'm going to call it here video. So it's going to be a video media. I'm going to execute this, and you can see, yeah, that was, I did that twice. Sorry, I did that twice. Okay, so let's just have a look. If I get it again and I execute, yeah, you can see media has now been added into my database. And if I should go and look in my database, you'll see that it sits there. You can see that I'm getting back code 200 success and so forth. And so my get and my post both work, and you can go and play around if I want to delete one. So if I want to delete one, I actually now have to say, take this ID that I see there. I'm going to take that ID. Okay, and then I'm going to say delete that ID. Delete, try it out. I'm going to delete this one. Okay, and it says here success. If I should get it. And it's gone. Okay, so now you can see that I've now, without much coding, it's really a question of setting things up, getting your right packages installed, scaffolding your tables and that they become database, your database tables so that they become models. And then this whole thing is up and running here. Right, and so basically that is how we do it. And then let's see if there are any people with any questions. Okay, so I think, yeah, have all the questions mainly been answered? Okay, it looks like all the questions have been answered. Okay, let me just start it. Ms. Miller, you answered most of the questions.
Yes, I have.
Right. Are there any questions? Does anybody have a question here that I haven't answered? If you just put it in the chat again. Okay. Let's just go up here. Okay, it looks like all the questions have been answered. Yeah, so one thing that we can say about, these DB context sessions that we create is that, you sometimes can, like what I've done here is I've created a DB context for a full database. And you can, for example, create different DB contexts in, referencing different parts of whatever it is that you need. And yeah, that can make the performance better and it makes it more flexible. So you can create different DB contexts for depending what you need. That is something that one can do. Okay, so that's been all from my side. So there's no more questions. So all that I want you guys to do is I'm going to put up a link for homework assignment 5. And so essentially what I want you to do is I want you to recreate, take the guidance that's sitting on Ifundi and go and do this yourself. And just to make sure you can do it. We haven't given you the database for project 2. That will come next week. We'll give you the database for project 2. And then you can just go and do something similar to create your controllers. And then we are going to be looking at, so you've created the database with controllers. The next step will be hosting it on the cloud. And then the last step will be to add security to it. So just make sure this week that you do that. Right, everybody. So that's then all from my side. And then we will speak again, when we see each other next week. Thank you very much. Keep well.